Hello and welcome to Libero. My name's Jack Pitt-Brooke. I'm joined today by Rory Smith, Tariq Panja and John Brewin as the second half of the week squad. And we're going to talk about a phenomenon that we have been thinking about, which is what has happened to footballers born in the 1990s, or more specifically from the second half of the 1990s. This might be a strange thing to talk about it, given this is the week defined by Declan Rice's heroics, obviously born in 1999, but it's felt to quite a few of us as if the best players in the world are increasingly from that 2000s born generation, you know, Haaland, Foden, Vinicius, Saka, Pedri, Palmer, Bellingham, Wirtz, Yamal, and so on. And that the guys you would expect to be on top of the game now, these are players born in the, you know, let's say in the second half of the 1990s, who would now be in their late 20s, they're not really so much on the scene. Rory, do you agree with this analysis, and where do you think it's come from?
What do we call those people? Like, so I'm a geriatric millennial because I was born in 1982. I'm going to guess that Brewin, who I think is a little bit older than me, is a Gen Xer.
Yes, yeah.
Panja's a year older than me, but I think he counts as geriatric millennial. Bindi, you're younger, aren't you?
1988.
So you're a pure millennial?
Yeah, I would say I'm kind of in the middle of the millennial cohort.
So is it Gen Z that were born in the 90s? Is that right?
I thought Gen Z was born in 2000 in the 21st century.
So what are are these players struggling because they don't know what demographic cohort they belong to? Is that
That must be it.
They can't define themselves. They lack self-identity, so they're struggling. No, I think so. I have a non-data supported argument that's like much more about vibes than anything else, which is basically, I think it's a combination of the generation before was so dominant, and obviously that's characterised by Messi and Ronaldo in particular, but like that whole Barca team, the kind of super teams that Real and Bayern and various Premier League teams built, I think they probably had like a longer tail than most generations, and we saw it this week. Like Luka Modric,
yeah,
and I did TV for the BBC on Wednesday night, and I didn't know whether I was allowed to say that I thought Luka Modric was really bad for Real Madrid. You're not really allowed to say that Modric plays badly, but he very much looked like a man who was nearly 40 against Arsenal. I thought he got like totally overrun, but Modric
is 40.
Is he already 40? Is he 40 this year? I can't remember.
No, he's 40.
Is he 40?
Yeah.
Don't play 40-year-olds in midfield in Champions League quarterfinals. That's my advice. But
no, he's
Modric
39.
He's 39. Yeah, I think he's 40 this
40
year.
on the 9th of September.
So like, he's a good example of it. Like Modric has gone on for ages and ages. So you have this generation that maybe lasts longer than we expect, which means that the opportunities for the next generation don't come. And I also wonder whether it's to do with kind of the ramping up of like academy production, where if you're kind of 23, 24 and you're not quite hitting the high notes, there's another like 19-year-olds coming behind you. Again this week, you've seen, like I watched a lot of the Barca game last night, and you've got Lamine and Balde and Pedri, and then Gavi comes on. You've got all these kind of super kids, and equally PSG rip Villa apart with Doué and Barcola. And it just feels like there's this kind of continual production. So basically, if you've got like the players who would be 25, 26, 27 now, if they have injuries or a bad season, it's like, well, you're done. We've got this teenager now. He's hot. We're going to play him instead. And I just wonder whether they've kind of been caught in a trap.
Yeah, I think so. And it's interesting what you say about Modric, because when you think about Modric's performance in the Champions League final of the one to beat Liverpool, that's 2022. At that point, you would have said, I said at the time, I think that Modric is probably the best midfielder of the 21st century. Mm-hmm. You know, like, there's no one really come close. But that long tail, another player that we've mentioned this week, Thomas Muller. You know,
yeah,
and like he's always played like he's a veteran, and now is a veteran, but I suppose one thing about that generation is that Thomas Muller, Modric, even Messi, Ronaldo, they have this thing which was that none of them really looked like what a footballer's supposed to look like, and then they became, and there's still the individual level there, and it felt like what came after was a sort of, maybe sometimes a weak facsimile of what came before. And it's always this idea that you get from academies that every player wants to be a number 10 because it was the era of the number 10. And it's almost like the academy system is churning out a certain type of player. Now, one player, and it's a bit of a sad story, though I'm sure he's, it'll be okay financially, is the sort of Mason Mount thing. Yeah? Mason Mount is a purebred academy player. Remember, of course, that his close friend in that Chelsea academy was Declan Rice, and Declan Rice had to find his own way in the game. Found his way to West Ham, started as central defender, now is, the free kick smashing, brilliant, all-action answer to, Brian Robson or something. And it often feels to me like the better players that come out of those systems are almost those maverick talents. Like, look at Eze, yeah? I think he had a circuitous route to where
he was released by almost every club in London for being too small.
And he's one of the best players in the Premier League. He's an absolutely fantastic player. And it feels like that sort of schooling, we're back to, God, we're not going to go into St George's Park and all that, are we? But,
Should we do a podcast about E-triple-P?
Yeah,
I feel like people want to talk about that.
Well, it's funny because it's probably at the root of, particularly in England, but, other countries have had this problem as well. And there was a couple of fairly disappointing international tournaments, but now it does feel like with Lamine Yamal and other players coming through that individuality is back, and La Masia is back. La Masia is back, of course, because Barcelona can't afford to buy anybody. And, I've always thought this idea that the best teams in football have that youth at the very heart of them. The best Real Madrid teams, the best Man United teams, the best Liverpool teams have youth at the heart. And it felt, for a certain part, that youth, with pure profit and all that, was just discarded because of money. And now maybe there could be a change in that approach.
I've got a question for Tariq, which is, given how much money there is in the game now, why do you think academies are failing to meet the demand of clubs for the type of players that they want?
Rory and I did a story a couple of years ago now about Brazilian academies, and they were looking at what Europe needs, and they were training players who are 12, 13, 14 years old for a certain position. At that time, I think there was left backs and number sixes. And then suddenly you get this, but it takes that time. There's a lag, isn't it? You're going to get the youth, you're going to develop this player into that position, but then a different need arises. It's a bit of whack-a-mole. So the players you described there, they're all kind of the same position, aren't they? If you go through that list of these young players, take Haaland out, he's a bit of a freak, but Yamal, Musiala, Wirtz, that kind of 10 position, they all seem to be in that zone. And when we're talking about, I don't know, where are all the great players from 90, we're thinking about attacking players all the time as well. I wonder if you do this analysis and think about, I don't know, a good central defender, because we don't really think about those. There's probably still a load of players, just as a counterfactual here, of players born in their 90s that play in kind of unsexy positions that are at the top of their game as well. So that in terms of the academy, they cater for what the market wants. And this is kind of that weird part of football as well, isn't it? You've got the game that everyone's wanting to win and watch and all the rest of it. Then you've got this business that is kind of underneath it all, preparing to trade in the future. It's kind of you've got to find a position where it meets, and this is where we are now. By the way, we forgot someone, Robert Lewandowski.
Yes, he's a great example. Yeah,
36 years old. We interviewed him in the summer, and it wasn't the best interview, I must say. I didn't find it particularly interesting. I mean, there's only so many questions you can ask about, so you eat your dessert first and all the rest of it. It's all been written. But his ambition, that it's just, I found that really interesting. The fact that you've done all of these things, and he wasn't thought of as the Robert Lewandowski of old because he was old. I said, how many goals do you think you're going to get this year? And he said, oh, yeah, my target is at least 30-something goals. And I thought, yeah, good luck with that, pal. And he's done it. Yeah. There's another, 10 games to go. I think he's on 40 goals for the season. This guy's 36.
He's got. I think the 2 against Dortmund made it 36. Certainly in the league in the Champions League. I don't know whether what he's got in the Copa del Rey. I don't know, but Lewandowski's a brilliant example, and there must be like a part of it which is that generation are the first one that really get the benefit of full-time like sports science, full-time conditioning, full-time nutrition, and so you do get a set of players who can go on until their mid to late 30s. And we were talking in the green room last night, which is one of I love saying in the green room. It makes me feel like a celebrity. But like Lewandowski's the same age basically as Ronaldo was when he went to Saudi, and yet Lewandowski, I don't think he will, but he could win the Champions League this year. He will still be playing for Barcelona next season, and it makes it look like Ronaldo sort of trundling away for Al Nassr is a bit of a waste. And no matter how many Ronaldo fanboys there are, no matter how glamorous it looks on Instagram, it is a bit of a shame that one of the elite players kind of gave away 2 or 3 years of his career when he probably could have still been doing a job if he was humble enough to fit into a team as Lewandowski's been.
Sorry, Rory, can I just pick you up on something? Just to clarify, is your view is that the kind of what you might call the sort of classic millennial late 80s generation has produced so many players who were so good for so long. I mean, not just Ronaldo and Messi, but Benzema, Lewandowski, you could even throw in, I don't know, Giroud or Dzeko or somewhere alongside, that they have taken up opportunities at the top end of the European club game and therefore effectively block the development of strikers 10 or so years younger than them. Because why would you take a gamble on a 24-year-old when you can just stick with a 35-year-old Lewandowski, Benzema, Giroud, whoever? Yeah, is that unfair on your? Is that your theory?
That is my basic thesis with a little twist, and this is very much a personal kind of not bugbear, like a personal obsession. I think there's a lot of it is perception that generation not only hit such heights and lasted so long, but kind of occupies such a massive part of our football consciousness. Like that is the generation that has had the greatest, like, cultural's a great word for it, John. Like, the greatest cultural impact of any footballing generation, I think. They're the first generation of like full-on football mainstream celebrities. Yeah. Like my mum probably hasn't heard of Robert Lewandowski, but she might well have heard of like Andres Iniesta. She might know that name. Yeah. She's heard of Messi and Ronaldo, and she's an 81-year-old woman who has no in fact, I'd say actively detests football. And I think we think of them so much, and we will at some point do an episode on Mourinho, right? That Jose Mourinho, who is kind of this slightly washed up manager, is still a massive figure in the popular imagination. Right. That my basic theory on all football is that we will come to see the period between, say, 2000 and the Qatar World Cup final as the ultimate golden age, in inverted commas. Miguel doesn't like me using that phrase because it doesn't sell books for him. But the ultimate like golden age of football is like a cultural phenomenon. Yeah. And I think a whole generation was lost in the sheer brightness of that starlight, effectively. Like we just can't see anything else except that generation. So I think you can probably come up with a decent list of players who are in their late 20s, early 30s now, who are world-class footballers. Van Dijk, Salah, Rafinha. There's loads knocking about. Bruno Fernandes. Like these are all amazing players. Rodri is the best of them. Kevin De Bruyne. There's no shortage of them. I think they fade compared to what came before.
I was going to say that that Lewandowski, Ronaldo, Modric, are they like the equivalent of those billionaires that are trying to live forever? You know.
Well, funny you should say that. Ronaldo, he's obviously got to invest all this money he's got. Yeah. One of the businesses that Ronaldo has bought, I think, is a company in Switzerland, which does exactly that.
Right. Okay.
For very rich people to live as long as you can, here's what you need to take. Have a bit of this, bit of that, a teaspoon of this, and it's going to like a bespoke potion for the wealthy.
The one that measures your penis years, I think, is one of the things it does, isn't it? Like, has he got that business?
Is it the guy? There's the billionaire who was measuring the strength of his son's erections.
Brian
against
Johnson.
His own,
Brian Johnson.
Against his own. Which is not that is not something you read. That's not what they teach you in NCT.
Do you reckon that's locker room talk amongst the older pros? You know, at Real Madrid or something.
I don't want to get into libel territory. I'm going to say absolutely not.
No, I suggest not. It's a joke, but
The Panja, when you say like it's a potion of a bit of this and a bit of that, are we talking like you need like a spoonful of either turmeric or turmeric, don't know how you pronounce it, in your tea, or is it like you need child tears? Is it what sort of ingredients are we talking about?
Well, apparently there are these pills that they form. You can buy them in Boots, etc. It's the same kind of firms that sell these expensive tablets to the generally rich people. But there are now these very, very specific pills for the super rich that are designed just for them. So every ounce of their body is measured, their genes are tested, their lineage, all of that. And in a capsule, there is a Ronaldo-shaped capsule that will help him play for Al Nassr by the time the 2034 World Cup takes place in Saudi Arabia. Who knows, But yeah, I mean, it's a good point that John's just made there. I mean, these guys are still playing. It's incredible in a way, isn't it?
And it is, but they are. There is a form of immortality for them already. That they,
yes.
I think football is really struggling to move beyond that generation. So if you could very easily go through, and people listening will be thinking, well, what about this player probably from my club, or what about this player who I particularly like? And there are loads of them. There are plenty. There's no shortage of players between 27 and 32 to 33. And Ollie Kay did a piece, your colleague at The Athletic, Jack, did a piece on this that had loads of data in it to show that, like, I think in terms of the minutes played by that generation, they are lower. I don't think it's that abnormal. I think football always works in cycles, and if you have a generation that lasts a long time, obviously opportunities will be limited for the generation that immediately follows them. I think as much as anything, it is a kind of perception thing that we just think so much about that golden generation of Messi, Ronaldo.
And I think that the new generation of, I mean, while I accept Rory's view that the kind of 90s generation couldn't get a look in, basically, because they had a lot of their peak years around the time of Messi, Ronaldo. And perfect example of that is Neymar. Obviously, Neymar had his own problems, but he went to PSG and they tried to sign Messi anyway. They signed Mbappe anyway. They eventually tried to sign Messi anyway. Neymar did nothing, and now he's kind of over as a top end footballer. But also the guys coming through who are like, significant 15-ish years younger than Messi, Ronaldo. They are clear. Like, the football industry is clearly desperate for Bellingham, Haaland, Mbappe at the least to be as good as Ronaldo and Messi, because Ronaldo and Messi have been such an amazing marketing tool. Like, if you haven't read it, our friend Josh Robinson's book about Ronaldo and Messi is really worth looking at in terms of how, what Ronaldo and Messi have done to football marketing and football capitalism and so on. The football industry so wants to create a new rivalry between those players, although my sense is that those guys are probably not good enough, or in the sense that they're very good, but they're not going to be like the best players of all time. But the one young player who might be is Yamal.
Yeah, I think there was a chance though, and I'm talking to you from Paris here. 2022 was a really important moment, I think, for Kylian Mbappe. That summer, where he decided to stay in Paris, was a huge blunder, absolute, for his career and for that. There was a golden little moment there, where this guy could have joined Real Madrid, and he would have had the world to himself briefly for this moment. In the end, he got stuck, or he allowed himself to be stuck at Paris Saint-Germain. It was very bitter. Didn't really. Obviously, they win the league every year, so it's not that exciting. They didn't win the Champions League. He obviously got the hat-trick in the World Cup, but it wasn't that moment. And that moment has passed now, and he, I think, is now in a rung of these players you've listed, whether it's Yamal, younger Vert, younger Musiala. I feel he missed his moment. So I wonder what the world would have looked like had Kylian Mbappe joined Real Madrid in 2022 and not 2024.
Is there an element as well in terms of how we consume it? And I don't want to get all Delaney, but it strikes me that and maybe everything in football I think is a function of age. So I remember watching that great Barca team of Messi, and I was at Ronaldo's unveiling at Madrid, and that Clasico rivalry felt so glamorous and so kind of exotic. And we're all of a generation that have had the Premier League marketing spiel shoved down our throats relentlessly for 35, 40 years, or maybe not 35, 40 years, but for a long time. And I think there's quite a lot of people who, there's a certain stripe of football fan, and I would imagine a number of the people listening to this podcast fall into this category, who have a sort of reverence for foreign football, who see it as exotic and interesting and different. And I think that Clasico rivalry that kind of peaked in those 4 games in 18 days, it's Guardiola, it's Mourinho, it's Ronaldo, it's Pepe, it's Sergio Ramos, it's that brilliant Barcelona team. That is the kind of culmination of foreign football, non-English football, as impossibly glamorous and impossibly alluring. And I just wonder whether now, like, we see everything of these players, we know pretty much everything about them. I think you can make an argument none of them really have quite as much personality. They don't fall into such neat categories as Ronaldo and Messi. They're not as easy to kind of divide along almost tribal lines. But there's a familiarity, there's a sense that they're all playing for the same teams. You see them against the same players all of the time. There's not that much. There's nothing to kind of lift them beyond just kind of, these are just more footballers. Do you know what I mean? They all just feel part of daily life, whereas there was definitely a point where Barca, Real particularly, and maybe Italy in the 90s before it, felt very kind of different and special, whereas now everything is a bit like, well, yeah, this Champions League game's great and Kylian Mbappe scored twice, but this team they're playing is basically as good as Bournemouth, and that kind of detracts from everything. I don't know whether that's a factor.
I think those Clásicos, though, I don't think there's ever been a world, sort of a domestic rivalry quite like that one. I mean, I'm sure, you could, in Argentina, they'll talk of the Super Clásico, and of course, you went to one, didn't you, Rory, all those years ago?
I went to one that didn't happen.
Yes, I remember it well. And, that was the point of... Well, I suppose that was the sort of start of the hipster wars, wasn't it?
There was a very bright skirmish in the hipster wars where Luke Edwards decided to tell people what bits of journalism were and were not allowed. Yeah. So I mean, and like all of us, when you grew up reading, World Soccer or 442 or whatever, you were drawn to the exoticism of those leagues, weren't you? I remember thinking who this bright prospect John Carew was. I mean, we eventually saw who John Carew was, and he was a perfectly serviceable big player. He'd probably do very well these days, actually, when you think about it. But it's that idea of foreign, and actually Sky started broadcasting La Liga just at this glamorous era, and then La Liga now struggles because it doesn't have that star quality, despite the fact it has Lamine, despite the fact it has Real Madrid. It's never quite got to that level. I remember not travelling back from Swansea one night because I wanted to watch, stayed in a hotel so I could watch El Clasico because it was so important, as a football journalist or whatever. It was, the Gareth Bale era. And it does feel that has cast a shadow over Champions League finals and all the rest of it ever since. And and as you say, a lot of those players last forever. I mean, Pepe was still wandering around this time last year, wasn't he? It's such a long shadow and such a glorious era. A bit like, and funny enough, the football was much like the 70s cast a big shadow over. In the 90s, I remember, there used to be loads of programmes like, you could watch football from the 70s. When you'd watch it, it was like, God, this is bad. But the glamour of those people that lived a different life was alluring. And I think that there'll be a lot of El Clasico retrospectives coming up in future years of those were the glory years. Well, especially with the Netflix documentarification.
Absolutely, yeah.
But then maybe it's just a cycle that so the 70s kind of overshadowed the 80s, partly because the 80s is hooliganism and it's Heysel and it's Hillsborough.
The football wasn't great as well. It was maybe a lost generation there,
Yeah. And then you get the 90s of Italy and Ajax, and suddenly this is that's kind of the starburst of modern football. But then we were talking on our WhatsApp group the other day about kind of the Champions League era of the early 2000s, and it's all a bit FC Porto, isn't it? Do you know what I mean? It's not like Porto winning it, then a really bad Liverpool team win it, and like a half decent Barca with under Rijkaard win it. It's all a bit kind of.
Well,
And then suddenly that leads into the glory years of Messi and Ronaldo. So maybe football has a decade on and a decade off.
Yeah. But I remember that sort of early 2000 was that it was pretty grueling to get to that because they had extra group stages and all that type of thing, which maybe pushed to now because we've got this, mega group stage thing that I know you were debating the other day. Will that mean that you end up with a random winner? Or is it's just we don't know. But those Porto era, though, that eventually threw us some main characters, though, didn't it?
Yeah.
We got Jose Mourinho from that. We got, Didier Deschamps as a Monaco manager. Maybe it wasn't all bad. And Rafa, of course, that you were very close to, Rory. So, those were glory days in their own way. Just that the football maybe wasn't fantastic.
I just want to try and take this in a slightly different direction, or at least come at it from a different angle, because we got a good email the other day from a listener on the Isle of Tiree in Scotland called Richard, and he said, is the growing number of England players with staggering drop-offs in form normal, or are we seeing it happen more frequently? He points to Dele Alli, Marcus Rashford, Jadon Sancho, Jack Grealish, Raheem Sterling, Mason Mount, Calvin Phillips, and possibly even Phil Foden as being players who have declined in their in mid to late 20s. Now, obviously, at the top of the show, Rory was talking about the amazing longevity of the previous generation. Do we think that, do we recognise this phenomenon? Could it just be coincidence? Do you think that English players have not been able to replicate the kind of longevity of the Ronaldo and Messi generation? Because if you look at kind of Kane or Walker, these are players who've been remarkably consistent for the last 10 years or more. I was interested by this email. I wanted to hear if any of you guys had a thought on it.
Is there a certain type of player as well with the two City players, for example, if it's Grealish and Foden? You get a sense that any maverick tendencies they may have had have been maybe coached out of them. It's also rote now. It's system-based coaching. You're going to do this when the ball's over here. You can do that. And if you're thinking these players are magical players, aren't they? When they're the players that you would get off the seat for in the old days, but they've been told, no, hang on, you're going to have to not to do what would naturally come to you. Just to slip into another sport briefly, it's like when you have a young cricket player, for example, who's got a funny action, but he's amazing. And they say, right, you're a really, really good player, but you're going to have to completely change the way you play in order to play in this team. And they just become someone completely different. And I don't know, Rory, you've thought about this before. I think you've talked about it, whether we're in the era of the coaches rather than the era of the players. And for certain players, that doesn't work.
Yeah, that's another of my pet theories, to be fair. And it's the City the best example. City used to complain. I think 2018 is when Salah wins Player of the Year, and City were really cross. And you got these kind of stories from certain journalists who may or may not have good relations with the Manchester City press office about how. And I'm really conscious that this I don't want this podcast to be thought of as being an anti-Manchester City podcast. Like we need to provide a little bit of balance to Miguel, but they basically complained that Liverpool players in that era got always won the individual awards, and you think, yeah, but that's because literally everything Manchester City do is prefaced or followed by, and of course that's Pep Guardiola's influence. They have this manager who is seen as a visionary. Every single thing he does is an incredible kind of, what a brilliant his fullbacks inside, what an idea. You can't then give the credit to the fullback, not really, because it's the manager doing it, and there is a tendency now, I think, football has become a coach's game much more than a player's game, and this feeds into the lost generation theory. I think that a lot of those players in there, Kane's another example, by the way, of a player of that kind of early 30s generation. He's had a pretty good career. There are still good footballers. But a lot of them have been subsumed into their coach's vision of the game. And I guess what happens is that when they either don't buckle to it, maybe the coaches lose faith in them a little bit more easily. Maybe they are the first player to be dropped. We've seen that at Spurs, haven't we, with Maddison, that Ange clearly doesn't quite fancy Maddison in some way. He tends to be, when things aren't great at Spurs, Ange tends to decide that actually doesn't want James Maddison in midfield. And I wonder whether that's obviously there are certain personal circumstances to like Dele and Rashford that are unique, but I do wonder whether coaches are more inclined to give up on players who have an individualistic streak in favour of good. Well, I think what they mainly want are good soldiers. And if you look at someone like Bernardo Silva, who I love as a footballer, I really love Bernardo Silva. But Bernardo Silva is fundamentally quite a good soldier for Guardiola. Like, he does what he's told. He does whatever he's told. Like, he can do lots of different things in a way that maybe
couldn't Bernardo have been like a better player though? Remember watching him when he was at Monaco? He was unbelievable.
Amazing.
It was like the talent he had. It was like this guy could, run a game and then he's converted to this. I'm not going to say workaday. He's a fantastic player, as you say, Rory, but like he's a systems guy. He makes the system like as compared to David Silva. I think he's probably a better player than David Silva. Sorry, Jack. But David Silva had that individuality that shone out a bit more. And I suppose if you consider that those players what's so special about Kevin De Bruyne as a Manchester City player is that he still had the ability to be the individual within that City team that no one else was allowed, really.
I think that was really the standout genius of De Bruyne in my mind, was that he was obviously the key player on a team. He was a key player on a team which was more synchronised and coordinated than any team before, in an era of increasing, coordination and systems play, whatever you want to call it. And yet, through that, he retained so much of his own individuality and personality and character. And I don't feel like the players who are replacing him, not just at Manchester City, but like at the top end of the European game, managed to can strike that same balance between the system and their individual personality.
And you want them to be interesting as well, because at the end of the day, we want stuff to talk about, narrative, stories, and the play. If you can just replace one body in a shirt with another and effectively do the same stuff for the system, the game kind of loses a bit of its texture, doesn't it? Because, it's a number on a shirt and it's moving around. It's not this guy and that story. And maybe with these new players, this new generation, maybe we'll get some of that back because they're able to maybe be a bit more of who they are, if we're heading that way, if that's going to be the tendency.
It is interesting, though, that we spoke for 25 minutes or whatever about partly about a generation that has kind of refused to wilt. So the Modric's, the Lewandowski's, Harry Kane to an extent, and then you talk about a generation of English players. And there is a bit of a weird pattern there. I think it's a completely fair observation that seems to have burnt quite brightly but quite briefly. That they, whether for personal reasons, they maybe struggled to cope with the fame, with the wealth, with all the sort of accoutrements of being a footballer, or whether it's because football itself moves on a bit too quickly. Maybe they're proof of. I mean, I think for what it's worth, I think Foden. It's a bit early to write Phil Foden off. Phil Foden will be back, but the others. Dele was for 2 or 3 years was basically unplayable, wasn't he? Dele was genuinely, and I think we forget how good Dele was to an extent.
Well, I think Jude Bellingham is the player, like Ali it's a very similar player, and Ali in the Premier League is the player that you would expect Bellingham to be, if you see what I mean. Very similar players. Obviously, Ali had his personal problems, and he's spoken about those. There's an interesting player, Bellingham. We don't see the best of Bellingham in this country. We didn't see him the other night at the Emirates. There's a player that is very special, but in England isn't regarded as that special. I mean, when you chaps travel to the continent, what's the view that you get of him from, say, Spanish press or around Europe? Did you get a different view of him?
It depends a bit, doesn't it? Because there's one Spanish journalist that a few of us know who basically hates all footballers.
Yes, of course.
And his view is very much that Bellingham's completely overrated. I don't know. Bellingham himself's probably worth a whole podcast or a section of a podcast, just because I think there's like a manufactured element to
He's
Bellingham.
the marketing star that they want, isn't he?
Yeah.
But he's not quite there.
But are we saying that because he doesn't, like, if he was playing for Manchester United, would it be different? Would it be like, this guy is the great English star of his generation? Is it because he's kind of out of sight,
It's a bit
out of
Pogba,
mind?
though, isn't it? It's a bit sort of...
Maybe.
I mean, the Pogba, that great big ad campaign, and then it turned out that he wasn't very good, and maybe Fergie was right about him in the first place. That happened, and then Bellingham. It was that big advertising campaign before the Euros, wasn't there? And it was, and you think, and footballers are always a hostage to fortune with those. Was it Messi before 2010? He did one and then didn't score a goal. And it's like when people do that type of thing, you think your ego's got to be pretty big, and you wonder what the rest of the players are thinking. And Bellingham, scored a couple of goals in Euros, one very good goal, of course, but the man in the street is thinking, oh, he's a bit showy, isn't he? But he's in that Haaland bracket of like he's the next generation. But I'm not convinced that at the age he is, we knew Messi was going to be brilliant at this point. Yeah. Ronaldo's a slightly slow development, but at 22 it was like, yeah, man, he's got it, and that's maybe only Lamine is of that level really of just like this is a definite, nothing can go wrong from here.
I think that is the ultimate challenge for Bellingham, isn't it? Because of the time that he's been born and that he's emerged into the game, his job is essentially to fill the space of the Ronaldo and Messi generation. And I think that's going to be the hardest thing to do in football. Right, coming up after the break, we'll be talking about the cult of the pundit.
Welcome back to Libero, which we all pronounce differently. I wanted to talk about the cult of the pundit, which I think is quite a uniquely British thing. And it came about because, you will have noticed, after the Manchester derby on Sunday, Gary Neville, the voice of the people, basically said the game was bad, and because the Manchester derby was bad, all football is bad. Because Gary Neville is completely neutral and is not largely a professional Manchester United fan. And anyway, so I have a little WhatsApp group with Mark Chapman and Chris Sutton before the radio show we do on Mondays, and we were talking about stuff to talk about. And to be honest, it's been a slightly slim pickings the last few weeks, just because there's not that much available before Liverpool blow the title. And I suggested picking up on Neville's comments and kind of going into it. And Chapman was very scornful because he was like, well, we've talked about this a million times before, and now Gary Neville said it, everyone's following it. And it made me think that the pundit does have like a particularly potent role in English football, and I think largely that's a function actually of the dead tree mainstream legacy media, because we've all been in press rooms where an evening game's finished and you need to get something out for what used to be called first edition. You need to get you've got like a 10 o'clock deadline, and you need a back page in particular. And the back page can't be Arsenal smash Real Madrid. It can't always be that. It's much better if it's Gary Neville last night slaughtered. And you see it in like the Express all the time. And you'll have reporters standing there with dictaphones to the big screens in the press area, taking down the quotes of Carragher or Neville or Roy Keane or Ian Wright or whoever it might be. And the back page will be, Roy Keane slams Enzo Maresca or whatever. And I think that's where this whole thing comes from, that pundits have become... I think they're basically given far too much weight, what they say. Like, we forget that they're just former players with opinions rather than kind of agenda-setting philosopher kings.
But
and
it's not...
Yeah, go on.
Sorry, just to expand on what you're saying, it's not just a newspaper thing, though, is it? Because
websites.
So much of it is... I mean, part of it is web traffic, but it's also virality.
Totally.
Like, you could never pick up a newspaper or go on a newspaper website... But if Jamie Carragher or Gary Neville does an epic rant, particularly like around the Sunday 4:30 kickoff game, by Sunday night, Monday morning, that epic rant will be circulating the internet at rapid speed, and people really care about these epic rants. So it can't just be to do with newspaper questions. Although I do agree the phenomenon of asking a manager, well, Gary Neville said this. I find it feels to be the wrong way around.
Well, so we've had pundits for ages, right? So this is quite new, though, right? It's since Neville and Carragher effectively joined Sky in the years after that. So what we're talking last 6 years, maybe, and then it's just got to this crazy situation now.
Well,
I mean,
Neville joined in 2012, didn't he? Because we had the goalgasm when Fernando Torres, and that started the cult of Gary Neville, didn't it?
But with the social element as well. And
Yeah,
I must say the Daily Mail website, for example, on after the Sunday game, if you have the interest in doing this, 20 minutes after the game, you'll see 7 headlines, 5, 6, 7 headlines, all off what these people have said there, rather than the game, effectively.
Yeah.
Now, does that change the behaviour of the pundits too, over time? I think, we are so influential. Let's gas this up a bit, and we're going to go viral. As Jack said, there's going to be these clips as well. Is one feeding the other? It's kind of a really strange moment now, where what's said on post match is the news, not what's happened on the pitch.
I was asked to write a piece quite recently about how it's even harder for Manchester United, because the whole time the glory years are out there on the internet. There's like 2 or 3 podcasts. There's Roy Keane, there's Paul Scholes, there's Gary Neville. The glory years are just being relived the whole time. And when they haven't got anything else to talk about, they talk about what it was like in the old days when they were winning stuff. So if you're a Manchester United player, you're just like, well, the whole thing is about this glorious time. And it happened back in the 90s with Liverpool, slightly lesser way. But, if you're a Liverpool player, say, just one of their sort of rank and file players.
Stig Ingerbjorneby.
Stig Ingerbjorneby. I was going to say Kramer. You remember him? And you're watching the TV, and you've got Alan Hansen and Mark Lawrenson, twin totems of this all-conquering team, absolutely smashing into you, saying that you're rubbish and that's no Liverpool team. And it's you wonder how it affects players and managers. I mean, I was up at Old Trafford recently, and someone asked the question, Gary Neville said this, talking to Amorim. And Amorim, I think, is quite wise to this, and just laughed and just was like, well, let's talk about Gary Neville's managerial career, shall we? I'm 40, I've made it here. What about Gary? But, of course, that explodes in its back pages and all that, and Amorim sort of knew what he was doing with that. But the funny thing, it deflected from the fact that Man United went out of the FA Cup that day. Yeah. And there's just this whole podcast extended universe of the 1990s player. And, maybe again with the thing we had before, it's like that sort of like the long 90s is continuing to this era, isn't it? I mean,
we can't escape it.
No.
That Liverpool parallel, I think, is really interesting. There's loads and loads of ways in which Man United now are Liverpool of the 90s. It's an easy parallel to make. It's an accurate parallel to make in a lot of ways. And I remember thinking, as a Liverpool fan, that they did suffer in the 90s because Hansen and Lawrenson, who I remember Hansen as a player, not really Lawrenson, but these 2 kind of big Liverpool figures would regularly say that players who were clearly quite good, were pretty good footballers, were dreadful. And they were obviously as fans do, they were holding their team to a much higher standard. And I think it did make life harder for Roy Evans or Gerard Houllier or whoever it might have been. Benitez probably as well. If you compare, that was 2 guys on a TV show. That was it. And you might get certain former Liverpool players doing the radio, or John Aldridge commentating for Radio Merseyside or whatever.
Yeah.
And there were a few around, but it was TV, it was radio. Now, I mean, and I'm not dismissing, because I think what Gary Neville's done in a lot of ways is amazing, and is probably far better than him spending his life either running like the Georgian Dragon, or devoting himself to like chemsex parties or whatever former players do who aren't running media empires. But it's just constant. It's this the overlap is the Manchester United of the 1990s extended universe. It's just this constant stream of I wonder what it was like about 30. There's a great tweet about someone replying to an overlap post by saying, "I wonder if they'll ask this guy about what it was like under 30." I wish I could find out more about that. And
you have to refer to him as the manager. They never call him by his own name. It's just the manager.
The manager. But the scale of it and the weight of it, and obviously our kind of location on Twitter or whatever is the football industrial complex. But Man United are the best example of it. There is there is a whole industry now of nostalgicising Manchester United, and you can probably make a case that United in particular have in some way kind of internalised and commodified that sense of we used to be better than we are. And that's part of what they're selling to people almost. They're selling themselves as the fallen giant, which is, I mean, it's so meta that it's quite hard to understand, to be honest.
Yeah, but with all of that, there's also the amplification. Like, there's loads of them just doing it. I don't know how many shows and podcasts he's on, or they are on. But then you amplify that with what Jack was saying earlier about social media, and it's like you're being swamped by these guys beyond their own content. So it's at a level that is kind of insane. It is football.
Well, when Jamie Carragher is doing a post-match interview, and that's another thing that happens a lot more now, is that the pundits do the post-match interviews. Carragher's probably a bigger, this kind of, hugely accomplished central defender, and a European champion, played in another European Cup final. Like, Jamie Carragher was a very good footballer. Yeah. He is probably quite a lot more famous to most people. Or it certainly is 100%. A bigger figure in the public imagination of football than the people he's interviewing, which is astonishing.
And he's cracked America now. And you've got that show that...
As have you, Rory.
Yeah.
Well, we both have Panja.
Yeah, okay. Well, what's it like to... No, I was going to... Do you get recognised in the streets of Minnesota?
I did. I did get recognised in the streets of Decatur, Georgia, the other day, which was that was a big moment for me. It felt special. But no, Carragher's huge. That show, which a lot of people hate and a lot of people really like, which is probably the perfect balance now for all forms of media. That's huge, and Carragher and Micah Richards are legitimately quite famous in the States because of it.
But that's designed to be clipped up and sent across the internet. It's an ESPN model, from your first take type of thing, Skip Bayless and all that something of just like get it out there, get people talking, and they've followed that model. And I mean, I don't think they do much analysis of football from what I've seen of it.
Well, so I went to watch them record it, and right. I'm intrigued by that show because of that. I actually think it has a more kind of, it's more significant for TV than just for football. I think that is the way that TV is going, that in that search for virality. And they are very big on, in Europe, you only see the banter bits because we're not allowed to show you they're not, CBS's
you can't
channels
show the clip
can't
bits,
show the clips.
Yeah.
Because of geotagging or whatever. It's blocked, effectively. They do normal analysis. They do, like, Thierry Henry did a perfectly serviceable, quite good thing on the night I was there on Antoine Griezmann. And there is that stuff does exist within that show, but there is no question the bit that they are selling, that they're trading on, is here's Micah Richards dressed up as a king.
Is Thierry Henry more famous now as a pundit than he was as a player? It's possibly quite close, And that's Thierry Henry. He's one of the best players we've ever seen in England. And it's like, he's known for being the third wheel of this...
I would say no, because I would say Henry is more famous globally, certainly, than he was when he was at his peak of a player. But I think at his playing peak in the early 2000s, when he had the Vavavoom advert and all that stuff, I think he would have been. I think he had like cut through with the general public that is probably bigger than. I guess maybe Salah is the only current Premier League player who would have an equivalent level of public cut through as Henry did at that point.
But that's really interesting actually. But then I think it's really hard to compare because even if we're talking about Henry's peak as being 2002, 2004, like even that part of football history which feels so recent and still feels kind of current to an extent, certainly to our generation. Football is so much bigger now than it was then. Like it is no longer like, it's almost like the default thing. Like you kind of have to point out. I don't really know because I don't have to do it. But like I imagine if you don't like football, you probably have to point that out to people. Like it's kind of a like not like if football
it's countercultural to not like football.
It's included with the software. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, exactly, totally. But with Henry, do you remember when the US scored? When the US conceded to Panama in the CONCACAF Nations League last week, and that the guy who scored for Panama, whose name I forget, ran up to Henry, who was pitchside, and hugged him because he was his favourite ever pundit. Like that's that is
not his favourite player.
Favorite player.
I thought it was pundit, unless I missed the gag.
I think you might be right though, because the guy probably isn't that old. He probably is his favourite.
Yeah, he doesn't remember the Invincibles.
But that era, Rory, you mentioned 2000. If he was famous in playing at his best in 2004, there probably wasn't Facebook, or it was just nascent Facebook then. So now you look at all these things that have happened in terms of technology. All of these people are more famous than they would have been thanks to this. Can I just make a counterpoint to the celebrity stuff? And because he's not here, I can praise him. James Horncastle, after Liverpool...
Is he more famous than he was in the 2000s? Probably.
Just about. Just about.
After that Europa League game, Liverpool-Atalanta, it was... He appeared on TNT, I think it was.
Yes, that's right.
And Klopp was leaving and all the rest of it, talking about these celebrity managers who were going to take over. And the other pundit, everyone was surprised how Atlanta managed to beat Liverpool 3-0. And you got this guy who's passionate, knowledgeable, and is able to impart this amazing 3 minutes of analysis to this audience who's used to all this other stuff we've been talking about. And you know what? It was amazing. And he in 3 minutes, he educated this population of football fans in a way they wouldn't normally. And fair play to him, he pulled it off. Because you look at the stuff on Twitter, which is, whenever we're on it, I'm on it, it's a sewer. But the comments that people do want this stuff as well, alongside this other stuff we're talking about.
Yeah, do you know and again, because he's not here, we'll say I would never say this to Horncastle's face, but that the number of TV people who are like, yeah, you speak to them about doing shows and stuff, and it's like, we want a little bit of that kind of James Horncastle after Atalanta thing. That has become quite a seminal piece of broadcasting within television. That it was done. I mean, obviously, the hair and the turtleneck help, and Horny's got his look and stuff, but it was delivered so kind of nonchalantly, but so authoritatively, and the reaction was so good that there was an inherent virality in that. And I think quite a lot of people looked at that and thought, okay, do you know what? It doesn't all have to be Rio Ferdinand shouting Ballon d'Or, Ballon d'Or, and that kind of self-conscious search for virality. It was just a man knowing it was the rest is history. It was a white man talking about something he knows really well and really cares about, and people engaged with it because it wasn't kind of dressed up as overly intellectual or aren't I clever. It was just like, this is Gasparini's Atalanta, this is what they do, this is what you should know about them, I know this subject off by heart, I'm good at this, here you go. And people responded really, really well to it, and I think it has made a genuine impact. You mentioned Klopp. Klopp always had a big thing about the Gary Neville's just said question, and he also hated the kind of the leading question of, did you think it was a penalty? And you got quite a lot of clips of Klopp saying to Patrick Davis in the Sky, did you? Well, did you think it was a penalty?
Yeah.
And Jack's right that a lot of this has changed, is driven by social media, and it's driven by the kind of the fame of the pundits and all that. But I do think, maybe this is a journalist being arrogant, I do think a lot of it's driven by journalistic convention. What Klopp never understood was, if you're writing a back page for the Mirror, you can't say, I thought this was a penalty. You're not allowed to use the word, it's not first person, you're not writing an opinion piece. It has to be someone says this is a penalty. So you would go to the screen and you'd be like, well, Jamie Carragher said it was a penalty, so that's going to be my back page. And ideally what I'd do is I'd get Klopp to support that view. And I think a lot of that comes from the fact that we basically don't have sports-specific newspapers. I think that desire to cast everything through personality, to turn everything into a war of words, comes from the fact that you can't put actual sport on the back page. You have to make it appeal to the general interest reader a little bit more, which means you need to put it into a sort of format that someone who doesn't really know whether it should have been a penalty or not can understand. And Klopp used to get really cross with journalists for saying, either Gary Neville thought it was a penalty, do you, or do you think it was a penalty? Like his view was very much, if you think it was a penalty, you should say it was a penalty. But that isn't allowed in our journalistic conventions.
So just to clarify, is your view that if you were to have a sports specific paper which is catering to an informed sports audience, it would be more legitimate to have a splash of penalty scandal rather than having people criticise penalty scandal?
Yeah, well, we asked Horncastle this because obviously he's the only person allowed to talk about Italian football in Britain, and his view was that in Italy like the pundits will talk much more about tactics. There isn't that same kind of quotability, but they are much more involved in the discussion. But also that the journalists themselves regard their opinions as valid on tactics, whereas I think we're all a little bit kind of shy to say. So I did a thing about the Rice free kicks on the telly, and it was only like 20 seconds, and I'm not qualified to talk about free kicks in any way, except to say that I think from 30 yards you shouldn't have a wall. That is just my view on free kicks. The goalkeepers don't need walls from that distance. And if Thibaut Courtois doesn't have a wall, he probably sees Rice's second.
Rory Smith last night hammered Thibaut Courtois.
You then get. I've had a little bit of shit on Twitter, and it's where the Twitter algorithm being terrible actually works in your favour. You don't really see any of it anymore. But who's Rory Smith? Why? What right does he have to advise Thibaut Courtois? And my only answer to that is, well, Rice said that the first goal happened because he saw where the wall was, which it's therefore fair to extrapolate the wall's in the wrong place. And with the second, Arsenal built their own wall.
Yes, yeah.
They said, right, the wall isn't where we need it to be, so we're going to build our own one to disguise the flight. And at that point, I think Courtois should probably say, I bet that's where the ball's going, and just take a step to his left. That's all he needs to do. And he maybe doesn't save it because the free kick's amazing, but you should be taking that as a clue, I think. And I think generally we're kind of conditioned to think that if you haven't played football, you are not, but you do write about it or talk about it, you're not allowed to have an opinion. Whereas in Italy, the journalists will say, well, I think the 5-4-1 was the wrong call. And that is a legitimate part of the discourse.
So are you going to lean into that a bit more then? Having dipped your toe into...
I've got a load of shit on Twitter for it. I don't want that.
But I think it's also worth remembering that before we had like viral epic rant Neville and Carragher, we actually had tactics Neville and Carragher. Like Neville on TV, like in the media, Neville made his name doing like very earnest, in-depth tactical analysis on Monday Night Football.
Do you remember the blocking thing?
Yeah, and then Carragher came in and took over the mantle basically when Neville started doing more other stuff. So even though they've moved in the direction of epic viral rants, they did kind of make their name in the media with earnest tactical analysis of hybrid pressing or man to man and all that kind of stuff.
But they've been out of the game Gary Neville's been out of the game since 2011. So you're a long time out of the game. And the rant he did the other day about how he doesn't understand this and they've ruined the game by everything being robotic and that on. I mean, the funny thing is, when you're talking robotic players, well, Gary Neville was very much one of those. You could see that whatever Fergie had said to him, he was following to the letter. And him coming out and criticising players for that robotic style of football. Now, I wouldn't actually dismiss what he's got to say, because the Manchester derby was just boring, a disgrace. It was too systems-based. But it is funny now to see people like Carragher and Neville, who essentially had to be drones of their managers, asking for the Mavericks and stuff like that. The pundit who people are drawn to is Roy Keane. Roy Keane actually is just asking people to be like him. Put a tackle in, which is what I do. Play the short pass, which is what I do. Make something happen, which is, well, guess what? That's what Roy would do. And it's like he only sees the game through his own prism. In Ireland, like John Giles is a similar thing, where it's like, this is how you play the game. You play the play hard and you play it with flair. And Keane is just this, he's a quotes machine, isn't he? Like, it's, even though it's the same thing every time, and they're waiting for him to just seethe. It's just like, he'll sit there in the corner and, Izzy and Micah are sort of, droning on, and then suddenly it's just like, Roy? And then they're just like, right, wait, off we go.
Yeah, but it works for everyone.
Roy, can you have a quick seethe, Roy?
We
need that for the socials.
We need 6 minutes, yeah.
It's working for everyone. That's part of the dynamic as well, isn't it? So they get the clip. But also, look, I mean, we work in the newspaper industry, or most of the time we work in the newspaper industry. Budgets are cut to the bone, aren't they? If someone's saying something viral, you use the quote. I mean, it's that relationship. It's a kind of a parasitic relationship between parts of the press and these guys. They say something viral, we'll take it. You get the clip, we'll get an article, we'll whack an ad on it on whichever online platform. And I think there's two functions of the declining media industry, and this together, and here we are.
Right, I think that about does it for this week's Libero. Thank you to Jack, thank you to John, thank you to Tariq. Thank you to you for joining us. Please feel free to rate, review, subscribe. And if you have any questions, because, we're not content machines, please feel free to send them to liberopodcast0@gmail.com. We'll see you next week.